minus 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Launch Sequence Podcast. Another week, another hour plus of space nonsense chatter. A lot of the stuff we talk about here is inconsequential, but oh boy, is it fun. And today we got some fun stuff to talk about. Flight models, ship balance, engineering, no more top speeds in spaceships. It's an interesting discussion, and it is an ongoing process in Star Citizen. The flight model is one of a lot of controversy and opinion. So I've brought in good friend and a regular guest of the show, Farrister, today to talk about some of the more nuanced parts of this system and how it might feed into things not just combat. Thanks for joining me, my mustache friend. How are you doing today?
Doing well. I'm happy to be here. I think we've got some interesting topics on the slate for today.
Yes. So at the time of filming, it is Friday, June 13th for us, but there was a Star Citizen Live just very recently, like in the last 24 hours, where they brought on some of the bigger names in this area of game development. And I don't think, like we were talking before the podcast, they didn't necessarily give us a heaps load of information that we didn't already know, but there were some clarifications in there and some interesting bits to pick apart. So I thought we'd jump in. Now, I unfortunately can't bring up my questions because Google Chrome has put them on a screen that does not currently exist. But let me just, I guess, start us out on a conversation, asking how the game has been treating you. It's been a little while since we got together on the show. We've been doing Invictus Week stuff. I don't know if you're getting into the PTU with StormBreaker, but how has Star Citizen been treating you over the last month and a half?
It's been treating me well. I've actually not done much PTU this time around, just because there's so much for me to get through on live. We got a few new ships through Invictus, and we also got the Idris as a spawnable ship. And with my org, I've been having loads of fun doing different things with that, as I see that you have as well with the GII. So, broadly speaking, game has been treating me well. I think this week is probably the week before patch 4.2 is likely to go to live. And I've had a rougher time of it this week. This is me tinfoil hatting, but it always feels like just before PTU goes to live performance seems to tail away. So I had a slightly tougher time this week, but I've really been enjoying some of the new content that's on offer.
Is that, you think that's is that CIG turning the lever and getting people into the PTU, or is that just the servers running their course and CIG is not really working on the maintenance anymore on live?
Honestly, right, I am so cynical. I'm like, they must have just switched off a load of live servers and switched on loads of PTU servers instead. It's probably neither of those. It's probably just like luck of the draw or something like that. But as Star Citizen fans, we deal with these issues and we like to attribute them and blame somebody for
Oh
them. So
boy.
in my mind, that's what was happening.
As Star Citizen fans, we have a tendency to blow small things out of proportion, myself included. It's part of obsessing over a game that's been being told you were going to get soon for a decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, like you look back historically, we've got a pretty stable game right now in general compared to the history. It's just those moments where you really want to be doing something and the game's like, nope.
Game said, what? You wanted to haul boxes? No, I thought you wanted to repair your blown up ship.
Oh, you wanted to spawn your ship in the hangar? Well, the elevators aren't working right now, but maybe later.
Sorry, that hangar is not available for you right now. Um, have you been doing a lot of PTU stuff? Do you have anything to say about this newest sandbox activity and I guess the reported exploration
The
gameplay
exploration
that
activity, yeah.
Oh
Um,
boy.
I mean, I've not played a lot of PTU. I would say a couple of things. Firstly, like Sandworm has basically been a meme for many, many years
Yeah.
about it being shown in Citizen. You've probably got the receipts. It's probably like 2017 or something like that. It was a long time ago.
2016.
2016. Well, there you are.
Yeah.
And actually, in 2025, we're going to see that in game. So that's a bit of a plus. Like something that has long been a bit of a meme for never having made it in game is actually going to be in game. That's kind of cool. There are some other Sandworm games out at the moment. So again, the cynic in me is like, this is a bit of competition. But as far as the event goes, I'll have to see how things develop. The reason I say that is, for example, Hathor and the stuff that was going on with Hathor, they talk about how some of these things are actually just here to stay now, but also some of the mechanisms are pushing people towards the most recent things. So I'm talking about here what qualifies for a Wicklow favor and whether that's flavor of the month or not, and how that's changed, I think, twice already. I think it'd be interesting to see. For 4.2, I'm probably more interested in some of the things that aren't potentially on the initial release. Some of the other things that we've been waiting for. That's more personally exciting to me than seeing a sandworm, but I appreciate I might be in the minority there.
Well, I do think that a lot of people are looking for feature development now, and even just the little murmurs of features coming into the EPT has a lot of folks perked up. But overall, it does seem like there's a lot more interest in the game at this point in time than there was at this point in time last year or the year before. So to some extent, that strategy is working for them.
And we're also about to run into the summer lull. Like right after Invictus, we've got Alien Week now, and then things kind of usually go quiet for 2 or 3 months. I don't know if everybody sees this, but for me, I love like looking at the analytics of YouTube and things like that. And just from my YouTube experience of doing this for a few years, I see that people's interest in Star Citizen usually wanes, something to do with the nice weather outside or something like that.
Yeah.
And probably the in-game events tail off a little bit as well, and then it tends to build up around CitizenCon again. So I think this is probably the bit of a last hurrah before a bit of a summer lull, but we shall see.
Yeah, and that's also kind of an interesting part of it is like usually, as you said, they're relying on things like the global events, the dynamic events they do, which are timed. But at this point, they're bringing in these sandbox activities, which will always be sticking around, and it will be interesting to see if that helps activity stay around longer than the timed week long or 2 weeks long events that they used to do.
Absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see how the nature of them changes over time as well. So I didn't really do much of the executive hangar stuff when it was released because it was wild, and I'm far too tame and civilian to be braving some of the wild stuff. But now it's really accessible. Like if you are just a fairly chilled, laid back person, you can kind of go in there, and they tend not to be super contested. Likewise for Hathor, it's like it's much better now for somebody who is not looking for like a really brutal experience. And I
Hmm.
suspect it will be the same for the Stormbreaker stuff. Like the first few weeks are probably going to be heavy PvP. But if it's here to stay till the end of the year, probably if you go back in, I don't know, August, September, it's probably going to be quite quiet if you're a more laid back, peaceful type. So I think it helps to make the content a bit more evergreen and a bit more accessible to the whole gamut of the player base.
Hmm. What if, from your perspective, do you think that these are going to be the kinds of things, and this is something we talked about on Captain's Table yesterday, actually. Let's assume that they will actually keep these things maintained, right? And they'll keep the interesting in the mission itself. If you go to Hathor and you wanted to go through that whole scenario, the actual steps of doing the Hathor location are sound. They work. The loot is good. The AI all work good. All of that is maintained. Do you think that these are the kinds of locations that will stay evergreen for years to come? Or by the time we reach 1.0, do you think they're going to be feeling like they have to replace these locations?
I, it depends on what the maintenance is like for them. I know you said, for argument's sake, let's say that it's easy to maintain, but I don't know if it's going to be. That for me is going to be the critical factor. I think they are interesting enough places that give things to do in the verse. Um, and as part of almost like a theme park of stuff to go out and do, like it's one of those activities, It's just a question of how well will it survive and persist through the patches. So, for example, was it 3.18 that they launched the coffee vendor in ArcCorp Area 18 at the
Oh
spaceport?
man, I don't
Yeah,
know, dude. The bartender, the coffee vendor, any AI that they talked about in that area of development is just a scar, a sore spot.
but it was what, 2 patches before it stopped working, and then it kind of got fixed a little bit, and then it stopped working again, and
Yeah,
like it when it was launched, like they loved talking about it. They're like, "Hey, look how cool this is, and it's so clever, and look at the how the AI is going to work and stuff like that." And then it broke very quickly afterwards. I
right.
think for all of these events, the proof is going to be in the longevity. Like it's great to leave it in the game if it still works and if every time they release a patch it doesn't break it. So that for me is going to be the litmus test. I suspect once you've done it, you're probably not going to be revisiting a lot, but it might be something that you do once or twice a year. And if the work on building the event is all done, all the assets are done, if it's not a lot of work to maintain it and just make sure it's tested on each patch that it still works, it's probably a good thing to have it in there as a here's another thing you can do. Um, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think it also makes for a really good location for other types of contracts that are unrelated. Just a really nice backdrop, you know. Oh, I'm finding a missing person, and they just happen to be at one of the locations there. It mixes things up for people.
For sure.
Um, as for this new one, Stormbreaker, I do actually want to go back and touch on that little bit of exploration because I know like I think people are taking it wildly out of the context of what it means. The idea of running through these activities, coming across these locations like they're trying to do with the Stormbreaker one. Does that feel like it's a strategy that's going to work for Star Citizen?
Well, it's got a lot of people excited. So I think in terms of driving activity, maintaining activity, giving people a reason to log in, it probably works. I don't know how well it fleshes out the stuff in the game. Like it's interesting, but it's kind of other than perhaps the thing about the outfits where you have to wear the right outfits to get through the right place, it feels like kind of the same gameplay that we've kind of had for a while. Um, I will I would be much more interested in seeing stuff that is perhaps more peaceful. So for me, like exploration is a perfect example to have a mostly peaceful gameplay loop and then maybe a little bit of fighting or a little bit of combat depending on what you find. So for me, Stormbreaker doesn't really feel that exploration-y. I know people are saying it's because it's funneling PvP, but actually you take that away, it doesn't really feel like super exploration-y.
But I think that's the problem is it's not exploration. It's just that's what people are saying was said about it. But what was said was specifically it's the next step towards exploration. And I think that was a bad way of saying it, but basically just saying we're putting in locations that'll have things to do, but you have to find them first. And I ask if this is going to work because if we think about a finished game where there might be 30 contracts you pick from and tons of planets you could go to and thousands of players flying around Pyro and Stanton, how often are players really going to be coming across these ADP locations, going inside, killing all the folks, finding the key card, and then following through on all this? Because none of this is objective based, right? It's not a Mobi-Glass. You don't get a pop up on the screen that tells you what to do. It's all like you have to specifically go through each step based on what you find in the world. And for such a large game where people are relatively scared to go in various places, I'm wondering if you think that can work for a lot of contracts in this game.
Yeah, I think it can work for a couple of reasons. I think first, I don't know if it's just the day and age we're in, but there are data miners that find things before they're findable. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
It's very difficult for I think CIG to hide things in the game because the data miners are there on it, and as much as they try and obfuscate that, people are like, find it or here's stuff, and you derive clues from that. So I think that's the first element. I think the second element is people share things. So it just takes one person to discover, oh, here's a thing that you can do in this place by chaining together X, Y, Z. Even if it's not in a mobiGlas, it'll be on Reddit or Spectrum, or it'll be on somebody's Twitch stream. Um, I think back way back when to like the days of Star Wars Galaxies or World of Warcraft when that was kind of new, and there were these quests that you could do that really weren't well publicized, how you could complete them. If you see a morphologist talking about Star Wars Galaxies, he talks about the original plan for the Jedi and how there was basically you could become a Jedi in the game, but it was all secret and there was no guide ropes to tell you how. And then somebody figured out, oh, it's just about doing X, Y, and Z. And as soon as one person figured that out, it was everywhere and everybody could kind of crack on and do it.
Yeah.
Similarly for World of Warcraft, some of the complicated raid content at the end game, like until somebody figured it out, it was a bit of an unknown. But then as soon as one person did, it was everywhere. So I feel like some of that stuff would be similar for Star Citizen, albeit in the age of Twitch and data mining, I think that becomes accessible more quickly.
Mhm.
I think the more interesting question for me is like, is the gameplay compelling? And that's where I was getting at some of the peaceful exploration stuff is. It feels like everything we get all the time has a combat slant to it. And
Mhm.
I kind of get that because it's the most exciting part of the game. It's like it looks really good on trailers. It gets people going. Um, but actually, I think for exploration in particular, if they're taking their first steps towards what they think is exploration gameplay, I'll be much more interested in seeing less of the twitchy combat stuff and much more of the cerebral, like figure it out. Here's a puzzle. Here's something to solve. Um, and I know we've got a little bit of that in Stormbreaker, but I would like to see more of that. Like Benny Henge, the first clues for Benny Henge were like data pads that were hanging around, left around. And I know that some of the story team, as they go on SCL or kind of those things, talk about saying, oh, we've left some clues on data pads and things like that. I'd be much more interested in seeing more of that. And I know data pads aren't a solution to everything, but I hope you know what I'm getting at, more of
Yeah.
the peaceful style.
Finding things. What if there are more collection missions?
Yeah, for example, yeah.
I think I think there are I think there's a lot of opportunity for them to just have collection missions for things like the artifacts that we're finding in various places and stuff like that. Um, and it feels like, to be honest, that was more their first steps into exploration than just adding new locations. I think it was a weird statement because Ghost Hollow is part of exploration, right? Uh, the Hathor locations are part of exploration. All these outposts they've been building are part of explorations. They've been building up to this for years. And so when I look at what is missing that's needed to make that a good time, it's the stuff that you're talking about, the assets that go into those locations, our ability to find those assets, FPS scanning and radar, our chance to travel between these locations with quantum boost. And so, like, if you zoom out, it feels like exploration is more about that than it is about whatever the heck Stormbreaker is. Um, but I find myself wondering, why don't we get more collection missions here and there that do give people this feeling of like people want to find things, and everybody is kind of worried that there won't be exploration when CIG has these little contracts that they're sort of talking about and they sort of put in, and they're like, find the Tundra Copion, but there are small bits of that that are missing that really add to the feeling of a good loop. And I don't know what you could do in terms of a sandbox activity for that other than just the normal sandbox that you're already in, like scanning and finding things. Do you have any things in mind?
Yeah, I mean, the now that we've got Stanton and Pyro, the natural one for me would be some sort of transient jump point gameplay, which involves a lot of scanning to find an appropriate area for a transient jump point. Then maybe some really good flight skills to navigate your way through it, and then maybe at the end of it, you can sell the route to the UEE so that you get a little bit of a payout at the end. It doesn't have to involve any combat. Something like that would be really cool from an exploration side of things. You build out some of the scanning gameplay, you get people finding things, you give them a reward at the end of it, and you reward their skill as a scanner slash finder slash pilot rather than you shot a worm.
But that I mean, that almost is just if they dropped in transient jump points and scanning, right? They wouldn't even have to do any sort of a sandbox activity for that type of thing.
But
I would
well,
think.
like maybe, but for example, it could go well with whenever they're ready to launch Nix. Like that could be a great like sandbox activity. Is we need to go through the transient jump points and map all this stuff and
Yeah,
whatever it looks like.
yeah, that would be cool. Let me ask you this then: do you think they're not going to do that?
I have no idea. Everything it feels like at the moment, every single event is a here's a thing to do, and there's a peaceful option, but you're going to get shot at by other players while you do it.
But what about what they've said in the past? Is it you just assuming they're not they're going to throw combat on into everything?
I hope not, but it kind of feels a bit like yeah, like supply or die, align and mine. Like these are like, oh, this is great. This is going to be a non-combat event, and then it's like, yeah, go out and mine some stuff or shoot people that are moving goods, and it's or move some cargo or shoot people that are moving the cargo. So I think they've all got that combat slant to them at the moment. Maybe I'm biased. Like that's just how it feels to me.
I got a question then. What if what if when they updated these, when they dropped 4.1, 4.2 or whatever 4.3 is, instead of even highlighting whatever location might be brought in as the main thing of the update, what if they just highlighted the gameplay that they were at? Like for instance, 4.1 had mining additions, the Hathor location, the Golem, the Geo, and like some balance changes. What if they had focused on the mining additions instead of the Hathor locations? Do you feel like people would feel less like the patch itself was about the combat?
Maybe, but and maybe they do that in smaller ways. So, for example, I quite like the patrol type missions, and that was kind of drip fed through the Navy patrol contracts that you could take, which kind of introduce it. Now, it's kind of like a small thing, but it's another element. I think they could do lots of smaller things like that. I don't really I don't really care if it's not the headline feature. Like they're always going to pick the most exciting thing to be the headline feature. I think that's fine. But for all the people out there that are excited for scanning gameplay or medical gameplay, or those of you who own an E1 and really just want to ferry fancy people around from A to B, like that's probably not going to appeal to a lot of people. It's probably not going to be the headline of actually the E1 could be because they're going to want to sell it again, but it's perhaps not going to be like the most exciting thing to the most number of people. But for the people that are interested in that gameplay, like that's probably going to be the most exciting thing for them. Um, so I think just making some of that content a bit more accessible to a wider spectrum rather than just it's always combat or this, that, or the other. I
Mm-hmm.
think that for me personally, that would be more interesting. Combat absolutely has its place in Star Citizen, and it absolutely is one of the most exciting and adrenaline filled game loops. But for me, Star Citizen is a lot more than that. And I kind of just want to see a recognition or more of a recognition of that. For example, if you're going out salvaging or mining or cargo hauling and it's part of the event, you don't feel like you have to tag on PvP combat or space combat or piracy or anything like that to all of these things all of the time. I think sometimes it'd be good just to have the option to have some peaceful things as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I am definitely of the mindset that there's a lot of stuff. I mean, I joined Star Citizen because I wanted to collect the data, whether that's on ship locations, military locations, mining, derelicts, whatever. Like that was my thing. So fighting is not my first choice, but I do get Squadron 42 has taken a lot of their priority, and combat is the most easy thing to produce and to market. So I get them doing that more. I I think it's once again communication issues. I think that they've gotten into this habit of marketing these updates as like with a name, right? It gets people thinking that they have this specific event that launches, whether it's called a Line in Mine or Stormbreaker. Those names, those words mean nothing in Star Citizen in the greater scheme of things, but they are trapped in our heads, you know? And I think that that draws a really strong emphasis to what is happening right now, as opposed to what could be happening in 12 months, and we could have 6 more of these sandbox activities, and I would hope none of them have a name, right? Just put in these locations. Don't try to make a big marketing fuss about them. Let folks find them and experience them, and maybe draw a little less attention to them every time you do something with it, because there are other parts of the game, you're absolutely right, that need to get focused on, and I think they do little things in those other parts of the game that can get completely glossed over. You mentioned the military narrative missions that we got recently. I had somebody tell me that every single thing they've done this year so far is PvP, where those combat missions are PvE, and they just get lost because like the focus gets so much put on this one little theme of the update. Not a big deal. It's not even a problem, really. I just think it would help with the communication of what these updates are about and what they're actually trying to do long
Absolutely.
term.
And I would love to see, whether it's this year or next year, I'd love to see a patch that is, I don't know, Star Citizen Alpha 4.3, fire up or power on or whatever it is, that is literally just the engineering patch, right?
Yeah.
And there's no sandbox activity for that. It's just like
Yeah.
or even you could take Xenothreat out of retirement, because doing Xenothreat with some of these larger ships with engineering would be awesome. Like, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. I would just love to see patches like that that introduce some of the gameplay that people have been waiting for. I don't care if there's a big sandworm at the end of it, even if it looks cool. I know that's me personally. Some people will care, but I'd like to see more of that. I know it is the stability year in theory, rather than the content year, but I think people are really. How long is it since we've been told engineering is just around the corner? It's quite a while now.
2023.
Yeah,
I believe it was 2023. We were told it was going to be sooner than we thought.
and it wasn't, was it? It was longer than we thought.
It always is. Yeah, don't tell us that because we think it's next quarter. That's what we want to think. But engineering is a good topic because it is a huge feature. I mean, it changes. I know you guys, everything's game changing. Stop saying that, space in the middle. Engineering is game changing. It basically takes everything in the game and actually makes it run on resources. But it's feature development, and they have been slowing down on delivering those features this year. They keep developing them. They're not coming into the game though. And the most recent that we've heard of now is the flight model stuff. This includes quantum boosting. It includes master modes, or rather the killing of master modes, because yes, master modes is dead. And it includes things like hovering in atmosphere. So why don't we turn our attention towards that, since there's a nice little discussion about it on Star Citizen Live, and start by just splitting those three up into their separate categories. What do you think of the way that they are deciding to define the flight model now compared to how we've had it throughout the years?
So I quite like it. So if we split those three into being your space flight, your vacuum flight, your atmospheric flight, and your quantum flight, all three of those would be used in different scenarios and have a different look and feel to them. I think that makes sense as a concept. I think as soon as you get into the detail, it becomes a lot more interesting and nuanced, which I'm sure we'll get into. But as a concept of saying you've got your flying in space, you've got your flying on a planet, and you've got your flying fast around places, like those are your three kind of broad categories for how your ship is going to fly differently. That makes sense to me.
Yeah. Have you ever felt like those three? I mean, obviously, quantum travel has felt different. Let's focus on space versus atmospheric flight for now. Have you ever felt like those two were significantly different in this game?
Um, yes, but not as different as they're going to be. So if you fly if you fly a reclaimer, it will feel very different in space than it does if you're flying over Lorville with it, for example.
Yeah.
You do have to be aware of kind of the atmospherics, but it feels a lot more of a drag on ships when you're doing that atmospheric flight. I think the updates to the atmospheric flight models are going to be much more going to be much more detailed. It's not just going to be you are in atmosphere, therefore you fly slower. I think you'll have much more interesting effects and much more interesting variances between how the different ships fly. I think that's going to be quite interesting to see as well.
Yeah, I was really excited about when he was mentioning that they're lowering the mass of these ships so that the small changes you make, like the component size or the weapon specifics, or whether you even have those things equipped, will make a difference not just on like the power draw of your ship, but it's in atmosphere handling, its top speed. Those those kinds of changes are super nuanced, and that's definitely going to make it a lot more fun to experiment with ships, I think.
And we already see some of that bleeding through into the PU anyway. So
Hmm.
anybody that's flown a hull C will know it feels very different flying an empty hull C to a full hull C.
Yep.
So some of that is not new. It's kind of just building upon it. But there's going to be a lot of tuning that they need to do as well, I think, to make the ships fly as they would want them to fly.
Yeah. So the space and atmospheric flight models being different like this, do you think that Star Citizen has the ability to be a big enough game, or offer big enough experiences that we can see people specify whether or not they fly in atmosphere or in space? Like, this is enough to change the way people play the game, or do you think this is just going to be something that people notice when they get an atmosphere and kind of deal with? How definitive do you think this will be towards players?
I I think it will depend on the player and the ship, and that's what makes it really interesting for me. So I think from what they've talked about, um, yeah, basically some ships will have control surfaces, and some ships will be very aerodynamic, and some ships won't. And I think that's going to make things very, very interesting, and it will give more personality to ships. I think how much you engage with it will probably depend on like how much you want to engage with it. So most of the ships, I imagine, will still have a thrust to weight ratio on the main thrusters above 1 because that's probably going to be necessary to get these things airborne. So I think in most cases, like if you don't really want to engage with atmospheric flight, you kind of just point the nose in the air, max throttle, and eventually you'll clear the atmosphere kind of thing.
Hmm.
But obviously that's not the cutting edge, and that's not dogfighting in and amongst kind of different rocks and trees and stuff like that, and that will require more of a knowledge. So when I was thinking about this, there are some interesting. I think there's going to be some interesting interplay between different ship types. So if I take for the example the Hercules series, for those that know their Star Citizen, the C2, M2, A2, they kind of look a bit like a blend between a spaceship and an aircraft. And a lot of
Yeah.
the kind of marketing stuff kind of compares them to some of the heavy lift cargo aircraft of today. Um, that could potentially fly quite well in atmosphere because it looks aerodynamic. It has got VTOL thrusters for when it gets in close. When I say it flies well in atmosphere, I mean compared to other cargo ships of its size, not
Compared
compared
to a
to a fighter.
caterpillar. Yeah.
Yeah. But exactly. And that kind of the caterpillar, or I don't know, the raft or something like that, that doesn't look so aerodynamic. It doesn't necessarily have the same level of control surfaces and lift. So I would expect the Hercules would fly in atmosphere a lot better than those ships. The Hercules would rely a lot more on the lifting body of the ship and the control surfaces, potentially using less fuel when it's in atmosphere because it doesn't need to fire its thrusters so hard. Whereas a caterpillar or a raft is just relying on the brute horsepower of those thrusters to overcome the air resistance that it's experiencing. So it's probably less fuel efficient. It's probably much more you point at the direction you want to go in and you ramp the throttle forward. So those ships, although they might fly similarly in space, they could fly very differently in atmosphere. And for me, that could be very, very interesting as a trade off between ship types.
Yeah. That that's super exciting. I mean, when you start to really dig into not just this, and I think this is one of the most interesting parts of Star Citizen, is like the flight model. We're looking at one aspect of the flight model being, let's say, the atmospheric flight. But on top of that, you have then your thrusters and how they respond to the atmospheric flight. You have the cargo that you're carrying and how that weight affects the way your ship moves. And then you go outside of that and you're thinking about, okay, well, there are this many players on board, and so we need this many evac uh, escape pods or suit lockers or beds or whatever. So many variables stack up towards ship choice, and this really adds to that. And that's what I've been really excited for with Star Citizen. Is like having to make the choice based on what you need to do and not what somebody else needs to do. Playing a game where you don't have to be told by someone else what the best way is to do what you want to do. You've gone through it and you've figured it out. And it feels like this opens them up a lot more to allow for that kind of thing.
Definitely. And I would love to see stuff like that where it is detailed enough that there is some sort of lift calculation that isn't just thruster go beep and lift you up in the air. It's maybe you are too heavy to use your thrusters. Maybe you've overloaded your Hercules so much that the thrusters just can't lift it. But I tell you what, if you can go fast enough in a straight line, maybe there's enough lift through the body of the spacecraft that you can still get airborne if you were a good enough pilot and you can
Mm-hmm.
kind of make it work. I'd love to see like nuances like that. That means that players are making trade-offs and choosing what they're going to fly and how they're going to fly it to account for the different conditions that they might experience. Makes
Yeah.
player choices matter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the stats in this game suck for everything. Like, there's not a single thing in this game where you can go and look at it in the game and understand what it's supposed to do for you. You kind of have to look it up online or something, right?
Yeah, and like see all this like atmospheric flight model stuff. It was mentioned during the Star Citizen Live that it'd be great to see a inside Star Citizen or something like that with more detail about this, because what I'm talking about here, like it depends on how deep they want to dip their toes in the water of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There is going to be a lot of potential nuance to how lifting bodies work, how control surfaces work, how they interact with each other, how they interact with the different thrust sources on the ship, how powerful the different thrust sources on the ship are, how different altitudes impact on your flight, different atmospheric compositions on the various moons and planets of Star Citizen. Like they could go really deep with this stuff, and maybe your ship flies very, very differently on Microtech than it does on Daymar because the atmospheric composition is different, because the thickness of the air that you're dealing with is different. Like
Yeah.
they could have this really quite detailed, but also with detail comes complexity, and for some people, that might be a bit of a turnoff. I've got a lot of
Mm-hmm.
time in Microsoft Flight Simulator, DCS World. Kerbal Space Program is great for some of this stuff. They can be quite complicated concepts to get your head around with some of that stuff. Once you've got your head around it, it's like second nature. It's easy. But there's a trade-off between having the depth of gameplay but not drowning in that depth. And it'd be interesting to see where Star Citizen
Yeah.
lands on that.
Certainly feels like this is the kind of thing that most small or quote unquote beginner level ships should have no problem handling. So you want to have a lot of starter ships having like VTOL thrusters and aerodynamic shapes so that those players don't need to worry about it as much. And then as you get into the more specialized ships that can make more money, you start requiring players to pay more attention to the nuance of the ship. And I imagine at this point it's hard to do that. They've been building ships for 13 years. They can't suddenly change them drastically to fit that. But I do think that there is some level of natural progression they can build into how ships act so that they're not that it can still be really deep and they're not just throwing newcomers into the deep end, you know?
But then you also want variety between ships. So, like, if we talk about the starters, the Avenger looks like visually it should fly quite well in atmosphere, because it kind of looks, it's got that kind of space shuttle orbiter lifting
Yep.
body type look to it. The Sulan actually looks like it's more about you point the thruster where you want to go and it goes. And I tell you what, you put forward and it goes. So it looks like that would be much more, I would rely less on aerodynamics. I would much more rely on the power of that
Hmm.
thruster. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. They're both quite accessible. Well, maybe not the Shulen, but the concepts of them are accessible to newer players as well. But that kind of visual cue should also be something that players take into account. Yeah, visually, the Avenger looks like it's going to fly better than, I don't know, Nomad or something like that, and therefore it does.
Yeah.
But when you get out of atmosphere, it might be the other way around, you know?
Yeah. Got to be a little intuitive. This is
Yeah.
like, it actually reminds me of the tractor beam. And I think it's funny how much anger there was when the tractor beam started to be differentiated, and you know, the smaller tractor beams couldn't lift as much. But I was really it, it really hit me when I was doing Blockade Runner, and I was robbing a criminal ship. We had shot it up, opened it up, we took out the cargo from the back, and I was getting it on board another player that I've met up with. He had a Corsair, and we were moving this 32 SCU box on his Corsair, and I could move it with my multi-tool. We all had multi-tools, and we could move it when we were in space floating around, but as soon as it got into the Corsair and hit that gravity well, we could not move it anymore. And I admired that, because that's forward thinking. You can't lift that big size of a box in 1G with a multi-tool. But if you're just doing space maneuvers and you're just moving things back and forth between spaceships, then that's all you need. And like, that level of nuance in deciding what equipment you take for your specific job is both annoying in a great way, but it's super rewarding. And I can't wait to see that same thing happen when I take my C1 Spirit to go fly down to some outpost, instead of, I don't know, my, like, most of the ships in that category have VTOL thrusters. Something else without VTOL, Apollo, whatever. Like, that is a cool moment, in my opinion.
Absolutely agree. Interesting, when you were giving that example of the Corsair cargo grid, I was like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had engineering gameplay and could switch off the gravity and bend the
Ooh, yeah,
atmosphere in that room?
see? Yeah, there you go. It doesn't even matter if you don't have to see that. I love that. Oh, that's good
But
stuff.
again, that for me, that's like going to be where trade-offs between ships like matter. So for me, the C1 feels like a ship that intuitively should fly really well in atmosphere, whereas other ships, like, it's not that they're going to fly badly in atmosphere, it's just that they're going to be relying on their thrusters to do the work rather
Yeah,
than the aerodynamics of the spacecraft, which potentially means you've got more fuel usage for doing that, but potentially you've got more powerful thrusters doing that, which maybe makes them better in a vacuum sort of thing. So I think this is where the trade-offs between different ship types will make for interesting dynamics. That wouldn't be to say that a C1 can't operate in a vacuum. Absolutely it can, and it will probably do a decent job, but it might not be the best in vacuum, whereas it might be more tuned to that atmospheric flight model. And that creates some interesting scenarios as well. So I know we're talking here about hauling aircraft. Obviously, there are lots of other spacecraft that could apply to. But in the case of haulers, you've then got some things that are going to be really good at going down to the surface, picking up cargo and bringing it up to a space station. Then you've got other things that are going to be much better about taking it from one space station to another space station. So you're probably not going to see many whole seas flying the caverns of Daymar with a full load of cargo, because it's probably not going to be the best thing for that, right? But a
right.
Hercules might be, but then the Hercules might be better off spending its time doing the atmospheric flight that it's potentially better at, and a
Hmm.
whole sea would spend more of its time in the vacuum of space, which would be better at. That's not to say neither couldn't do the other one, it just might not be as efficient. So suddenly, again, player choices matter. You choose the ship that does the thing that you want to do more.
Yeah. And I'm hoping that the contract, I mean, I know a lot of this gameplay we're talking about would take place in the sandbox, from people just finding prices, getting the goods they want, and getting to the place that they want to go. But I hope that contracts in the hauling area kind of reflect this level of thought when they're looking at cargo packages that maybe need to go from an outpost somewhere on a planet up to the LEO space station. They, like, that factors in, okay, well, this obviously would be sending 12 SU of minerals up to the LEO, and the LEO would send, I don't know, 10 SU of food supplies back down to this remote outpost. And then, like, a city would be like, well, this city is sending, 50 SU of refined ore up to the space station. And you want to see that sort of nuance also in the contracts that reflect how they want us to play the game itself.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I know we're deviating a little bit from the flight model, but that's kind of all the stuff that this builds out, is it?
Yeah.
It encourages those different choices, those different consequences. I like that idea about having distinct segments between space flight and atmospheric flight. I
Yeah.
think the nuance comes in where you've got different atmospheric compositions, and I mean that by the different planets and moons of Star Citizen, but also by like the altitude. The higher up you get, the thinner the atmosphere is, and so the less your control surfaces will do for you, and the more you will rely on your thrusters. Um, so I'd like to see like some smart-ish mechanics that reflect that. That actually, the higher up you are, you're maybe switching between control surfaces and
Mm.
relying more on thrusters, and for some spacecraft that's going to make them more efficient, for some spacecraft that's going to make them less efficient. I think that kind of interplay will be quite interesting because it will also mean that you'll want to do different things depending on what you're flying. So if you're flying something very aerodynamic, you might want to get down low as quickly as possible so you can make use of the fact that it flies aerodynamically. Whereas if you're flying something that is less aerodynamic, you might want to get up to altitude as quickly as possible so you can do more of your flying at altitude. It'd be interesting to
Yeah.
see.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an exciting part of the development of this game. I'm not huge on the flight model, and you guys can probably tell just from our conversation, neither of us are super into ship combat. And I think it maybe gives this conversation a little bit of a better perspective from probably a pretty wide swath of the community who doesn't focus mainly on dogfighting. So I I do think that this is exciting outside of combat for things that we're talking about here, and it's not just about what heavy fighter can do what and how fast can I go with afterburners and all that kind of stuff. That
But it's
being said,
exciting. It's exciting for ship combat as well, right?
oh well,
Because
yeah.
you're gonna have more nuance to different engagements again between ship types and how you tune your ship. So at the moment, like there's like almost like a meta that develops about what people use to fly. Um, I would love to see it where some fighters are a better choice for fighting in atmosphere than fighting in vacuum. And then it almost becomes a bit of an interplay between if you are in something that's a really good atmospheric dogfighter, you're kind of trying to bring your opponent down over so you can fight them in your favorable conditions, and vice versa. If you're in something that perhaps isn't quite as aerodynamic but maybe flies better in the vacuum, you're trying to coax them up off the surface of the planet and say, come on, fight me up here, kind of thing. I think that could be quite interesting. I also think that the way that people fly and fight could be quite different. Again, it depends on the detail of how this stuff is implemented, but at the moment in space, you fly in a direction, you have a vector that your velocity is taking you in. To change that, you need to fire thrusters, right? That's the only mechanism you've got. Some thrusters are more powerful than others. So Yogi talked about in SCL that there's kind of a pear-shaped or a balloon-shaped thruster efficiency whereby your ship flies forward more efficiently than it does in another direction.
Hmm.
But in space, that's all about the thrusters, right? How much thruster power can you fire in a direction to change the direction that you're going in? In atmosphere, it's not just going to be about thrusters. It's also going to be potentially how you can use the aerodynamic body of the fighter to change your direction. So you could potentially move more inherited velocity into a different direction than you could do in space, which is going to potentially make atmospheric combat feel very different from space combat because it's not just about which direction you put the power in, it's about how you use the energy that you've got and manipulate that in such a way that you can change your direction with it. I don't know
Yeah.
if I've explained that very well, but it could potentially be quite
No, I
interesting.
mean conservation of energy through the redirecting through the wind. I mean that's that's why it's so much fun to play those kinds of games. I remember there used to be this old uh dogfighting game called Over G Fighter, and it was like the one sort of ship, or I don't know, jet fighter game I really got into. And it was because it did such a good job of making it feel like you were pulling against the wind and the air resistance. And if you can nail that, then it feels really crunchy to fly in atmosphere. And the most exciting part of the atmospheric flight to me is one that I have gone on and on about for years now. Probably people are tired of hearing me talk about it, but I like to call it hover mode V2 because it feels more like the natural way that they want us to worry about hovering as opposed to their sort of artificial attempt from several years back. Um, and he kind of talked about this. You basically, as you mentioned, you would start to rely more on your thrusters as you lost that airspeed. And those thrusters, being maneuvering thrusters or whatever they are, if they're not VTOL thrusters, aren't meant to sustain lift for a long time. And so you'd have this thrust ratio he mentioned where your ship is either too heavy for the thrusters to support or something like that. I need to listen to it again to get it clearly. But it's insinuating that ships are going to take damage or fail out from sitting in the air for too long. No more pointing straight at the ground and shooting people. No more kind of just sitting there in your ship halfway taken off and like sitting sideways as you list about. It seems like there's going to be consequence to that. I am interested in hearing from you how far you think that will go. Do you think they're just going to have people start being terrified of hovering? Will this be more of a long-term buildup, wear and tear, in your opinion? How do you think they're going to go about this, limiting people from just sitting around in the air?
Well, I'd like to see it nuanced and depend on where you are and what you are in. So, um, for example, so one of the low atmosphere moons, like I don't know, Daymar or Yella or Selin or somewhere like that, like I would imagine most ships should be able to pretty much park up indefinitely and hover midair in those low atmosphere planets because there's not a lot of gravity and um, compared to some of the high atmosphere, high gravity locations, like most of the thrusters should be able to do that. So even if you're sat in a reclaimer, like it's heavy if you're on microtech, but it shouldn't feel that heavy if you're on a moon. Um, the flip side to that would be if you've got something like a Gladius, which intuitively feels like it should be quite aerodynamic, you could probably sit and hover in a place like Microtech, but your downward thrusters are going to be doing all of the work, and the downward thrusters aren't that powerful on the Gladius.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to see more nuance in how that works. So, for example, if you are determined that's what you want to do, maybe you tilt the nose up and you just have the nose facing up 90 degrees, pretending to be a Sulan, role playing as a Sulan, and you've
Yeah.
got those main thrusters pointing down, and then all you're doing is correcting for wind shear. That could be a way to do it. I would love to see it where it's more efficient. Rather than doing that, if you want to stay in orbit around a zone, you just do a little slow forward flight in a big circle around the target area, and then you get all the advantage of all of that lift that's being generated for very little thruster work. So if you wanted to sit above an outpost, rather than literally just sitting there and hovering, it'd be more efficient for you just to do a slow, steady orbital circle around it in the air, and you're
Yeah.
going to use hardly any fuel doing that. So you give the players the choice. You can say, hey, if you want to make this work and you want to hover, your ship is light enough, the engines are powerful enough, you can do that. You're going to burn more fuel doing it than if you do it the more efficient way. You choose what you want to do.
Do you think that this is going to get a lot of backlash?
It's hard. It's hard to know. I think it depends on how complicated they make it. I'm talking about all of this stuff here conceptually because we don't have the detail of exactly how it's going to work. So
Yeah.
I'm drawing on inferences from other games that I've played. I would love to see it really complicated and nuanced because that lets players do creative things. I think the more complicated they make it, the more backlash they will get because it becomes a chore, it becomes a task. People have bought ships that have used to be able to do things very easily. Maybe it's going to be harder to do that with those ships now. That's the sort of thing that would attract backlash. To be fair, I would say Yogi seems to have a vision for how he wants this stuff to work. And he seems like quite a pragmatic person that, on the one hand, would say, I'll listen to all of the feedback out there, we'll take it on board. But also, if he disagrees with somebody, he'll say, but I disagree with you there, so we're going to do it this way.
Mhm.
I quite like that. There's somebody that's potentially able to listen, absorb feedback, but also not be blown around by it. There will be others that think that Yogi is probably the worst thing that's ever happened and they ruined my flight model. But for me,
Ooh.
Yogi feels like quite a balanced and a thinking person who will reflect on these things. So it'd be interesting to see how deep they go with it. But the deeper they go, the more depth there is in the gameplay potential. I think that makes Star Citizen a better game, just harder to access.
Same. And I hope that they allow it to get deep and complex. Just do it on the other side of the scale from where you've got all the beginners sitting. Let them have their more casual, easygoing stuff. And I think make it more difficult. But yeah, I unfortunately I do think that this is going to be a moment of consternation for some people, and we'll have to see how it goes.
It
I hope
could
they
be,
stick with
and
it.
I would love to see it impact bigger ships a lot more than smaller ships. Because that's kind of the general trend I would like to get to with Star Citizen is this stuff impacts bigger ships more than it impacts smaller ships. And it's the same thing for me with engineering. You know, when we do get engineering and resource management and fires and repairs and all of this stuff, like I would hope it doesn't feel too different if you're flying a Gladius, right? I would hope that when engineering is implemented, flying a Gladius feels mostly the same as it does now, because the focus is on you're the pilot, you're doing the stuff. There might be a little bit of tuning and things like that you do, and every now and then you might need to fix things up or repair things. But when you're out and flying, I would hope it kind of feels very similar to now. If you're
Yeah,
flying, if you're flying a Hammerhead, I would hope it feels very different because I would hope there is a reason for you to be putting out fires and doing repairs and managing the power and managing the resources. And I kind of feel the same way for the atmospheric flight model. I feel like there should be much more nuance on the smaller ships, but if you're flying an Aurora, you can kind of make it work whatever. If you're flying an Idris, I would expect you as the pilot to be really planning quite carefully what maneuvers you're going to make when you're atmospheric, because if you do make a mistake, maybe it's going to fall out of the sky, just like the Reclaimer used to.
yeah, yeah. I will say this. I agree with everything except I certainly hope that you're not just having to put out fires for no reason. Like on the Hammerhead, if you're cruising around, you should be still cruising around in peace. And I think that's what a lot of people worry about. It's like for some reason CIG will just randomly make things break and fires start up. And I think they're well aware that they need to not randomly throw people for a loop like that.
I think there'd be two reasons that fires start on that Hammerhead. The first is it's doing what it's supposed to do, and it's in a big combat fight, right?
Yeah.
That would start a couple of fires. But secondly, I'd love to see like the solar flare gameplay in Pyro. Like I'd love to see that be a differentiator for stuff like random fires, so it wouldn't happen in Stanton. But hey, you get your solar activity warning in Pyro, and that does start a fire. That's kind of a reason it would happen.
Yeah. You mentioned Yogi earlier, and I feel like at least in the last year, you can't bring up Yogi without also talking about master modes. Um, Now, I hate to gloat, but we got a little bit of an update on the flight model plans back in December. And I made a video about that update after listening to what they were saying. And on the thumbnail for that video, I put that Master Modes is dead. Kinda, in parentheses. And people got real pissed about that. But at this point, Yogi has basically confirmed Master Modes is dead. Nav mode is going away. Our typical flight will be our typical flight with around a 300 meter per second cap on non-customized ships. How do you think people are going to react to this? Is the game saved, Farrister? I was told last year that the game was dying because master modes existed. So if they're taking it away, is the game saved?
Oh, we're gonna have the same debate that we had last time. I don't think Master Mode is dead. I don't think Master Mode is going away.
Uh-oh.
Yogi spoke into the camera and said Nav Mode is dead. Nav Mode is going, right?
Yeah, but what else is there besides nav mode?
Quantum boosting. That becomes the alternative Master Mode for me. That is your fast travel mode. I imagine there will be some trade off for quantum boosting so that you're not going to have Henry Cavill just quantum boosting into a Vandal fleet and just blasting stuff away. It looks great on a cinematic. From a gameplay perspective, if you've got little fighters that are just beep, 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 quantum boosting everywhere, it's not going to feel like the kind of dogfight they're going for. So I suspect there is going to be some sort of master mode type trade off to entering into a quantum boost mode that we have now for entering into the nav master modes. Whether you call that master modes or not, I don't know. But for me, it
I
feels like nav mode is gone, but master modes might not be.
If they implemented it how you say, then yeah, that's functionally the same as master modes. The way I see it is we've always had SCM mode, right? it's been the standard, and then in SCM mode you would switch between operator modes. So I figured that they would basically just have the quantum boosting be the same operator mode as quantum travel, and then those would just live alongside like guns, mining, salvage, scanning. But if they do split quantum boost out as its own thing and they make you do some weird mumbo jumbo delay to get into that, then yeah, master modes lives on, I guess.
I would rather they split it out, because if you are quickly going between SCM guns, SCM missile, SCM scanning, which you might do in a combat scenario, you wouldn't want to accidentally click into SCM quantum boost and then your shields go off and your weapons go off. Like, for me as a pilot, I would rather they were specifically separated into master modes so that I can't mess up as I'm switching between the operator modes. But again, this is going to be in the detail. We don't have the
Yeah.
detail to know how it's going to work.
All right, fine, guys. Master modes isn't dead. Maybe. Um, besides that, even if it is or is not dead, nav mode going away is a big change. It's not one that we have experienced just yet because we still have the ability to go into nav mode. But I don't think the game has ever limited conventional flight to this degree before. I'm not a big fan of it, to be honest, but he also has stated that top speeds are going away, and that the components you have, the way you tune them, the way you shunt your power around, all of that is going to allow you to achieve higher speeds than other people. To what degree do you think that's going to be possible?
So it'll be interesting to see the detail. Logically, I think that should depend on a lot of factors. So I don't think top speeds can go away in an atmospheric flight model. I think there has to be a top speed in an atmospheric flight model, because you get to the
Yeah.
point where air resistance overpowers your thrusters and aerodynamics, etc., etc.
Yeah.
You could tweak that by focusing your thrusters, so you could potentially change what that top speed is. But I think it would always have to exist, at least in an atmospheric context, to make sense of those constraints.
Hmm.
Um, as far as the rest of it, I think it makes it would make sense for top speeds to absolutely go away when you're in a vacuum. If you are traveling at a certain velocity and you carry on applying thrust in that direction, you are adding to the energy that you've got going in that velocity. So from a pure Kerbal Space Program perspective of you're firing the engines, you should go faster and faster and faster. For a lot of people, I think that would be quite complicated, because anyone who's played Kerbal Space Program knows it's very easy to mess up when you're doing that. And if you're trying to get into a dogfight or something like that, and one of you is carrying 1,500 meters per second, depending on the performance of the engines, it might take a long time for you to slow down to speeds to effectively engage.
Yeah.
And if there were unlimited, unconstrained top speeds, it's going to mean a lot of people miss engagements, or at its worst, it encourages jousting, and that feels like nobody wants a jousting situation where you just speed in, shoot at somebody, and then speed out. Like, that doesn't feel like good gameplay. So I feel like there will need to be some sort of a top speed cap in order to encourage the sort of dogfighting in space that I think they want to encourage. I think what will become more nuanced is what that top speed is by ship, by component, by tuning, by how you set your power. So it'll be much more organic. So it won't just be you're in a Gladius, therefore the top speed is this. It will depend on the engines you've got equipped, how you've got your power assigned, maybe any of the flight blades that you've got equipped and things like that. Maybe even whether you've got your IFCS on or off, and that will be one of the trade-offs. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see where we go with it, but I feel like we probably will have some constraints on there just to funnel people into still fighting the way that they want them to fight.
I think there will definitely be a top speed in the sense that like everything is gonna slowly. It's a what is it? Not a logarithmic curve. Yeah, I guess it's kind of logarithmic, right? It'll cap off towards the top. It'll taper off, and your speed advancements might be negligible by that point. But I do wonder what kind of range they're thinking. You know, if they would say there's a hard cap at 300 meters per second SCM on a Gladius, you can craft a tier 5 Gladius, and then you can throw in a tier 3 power plant and have all of your power shifted in your power management system towards your thrusters, and you can get up to like 650 meters per second. That would be insane. That would be incredible. The difference that you could create in scenarios based on what you've found and what you've unlocked and what you've made would allow for so much more obvious progression to players, but it really would depend on how hard it was to get that stuff and how big a window that is. What would you realistically like to see as like a upper level speed on say a 300 meters per second ship if it got fully upgraded?
Well, again, I think I would probably tilt towards like really mitigating the impact. So almost like what they've done with the flight blades, it should feel like a tweak, a customization rather than a completely different ship. So for me, with everything, right, with flight blades, with building a ship in a certain way, using the certain materials, with how you've set your power up, all of this stuff, I would say kind of plus or minus 20%. Kind of feels for me like you've min-maxed that the way that you want to fly, but it's not going to be like totally game breaking for if you go up against another Gladius that's built something different. It rewards you in the way you want to fly, yes, but it's not a different ship. I would say maybe 10 to 20% max for that, but that's all in the balancing, right? I'm not a game dev. I don't have to deal with how all of this stuff interplays with each other. I would probably err on the side of less. It should feel like a customization. It should feel like a tweak. It shouldn't feel like a totally different ship.
Yeah, that's a good call. The balancing nightmare of this all is just painful, debilitating. I don't even want to think about it.
The other interesting element to it is with these changes, do we anticipate, and I know this wasn't mentioned in the SCL, but it's kind of part of the same conversation. Do we anticipate the sort of speeds at which ships engage each other to change? So at the moment with master modes, we've got what are historically quite low speed engagements compared to what we used to have way back when. One of the criticisms of master mode is it slowed down the combat from some of those high speed combats that we had in the past. Do these changes creep that back up? Do they go all the way back up to where they were? Or actually are the speeds that we're engaging at now the sort of speeds that the developers want us to be fighting at?
I think it's the latter. That's why I don't know about you or anybody else who's listening to this. I was of the mindset that this is always how it would be, that eventually engineering and all that kind of stuff would limit how you could use your ship, what speeds they flew at, what would be a comfortable engagement, all that kind of stuff. And then master modes came around and the changes that they wanted to do there. And it was like that artificial shields off or shields on sort of thing, your speed's going this speed kind of thing. And I can see now the halfway point between what that expectation was and where they were going with this more artificial solution. And I'm glad to see it. I'm actually a little bit surprised because I thought that they were swinging completely in the other way. So hearing that it will come down to what weapons do you have attached? What components are you using? How much power have you shunted over? Is your ship being taken care of? That is a very exciting prospect that I was kind of unsure they were going to still go through with. So I don't know to what extent it's going to be. I don't really mind. It's just the fact that they're trying to design the game like this is still very encouraging to me.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's going to feel different fighting in a Corsair that is loaded up with cargo than a Corsair that's empty. And that feels as it should be to me.
When you're getting chased through the atmosphere and you have to dump boxes out the back so you can get away, you
Yeah,
can fly faster.
or even in a vacuum, right? You're going to be a heavier ship. You'll carry more mass, so you'll be slower to turn. Like,
Yeah.
that feels right. And like you say, that introduces the interesting decisions like we need to jettison the cargo off the side so we can go faster. Like, I love that sort of thing where there is enough detail in the way things work in the game that you can make choices, different choices that will kind of get you out of different situations.
So, in your opinion, looking at these changes and how they're communicating them, we didn't touch on everything that was talked about this week, but I think we hit some of the biggest points. And like you said, there's going to be an inside Star Citizen when this gets closer and when things are actually going to come into the game. Right now, folks, this is still a preview. I don't think this is a long, long way away, but I don't think this is the kind of thing we're going to see before Q4 of this year. Nonetheless, this was a lot of, I think, good discussion to have about this. And I want to close off by asking you how you think this affects the outlook of the flight model. It's been all over the place. And I think a lot of people will say this 13 years in, and they're still working on flight. What the heck are they doing? And I'm interested in hearing if you think they are finally headed in the right direction that they can stick with. Is it becoming more arcadey or more sim? Is it getting better or worse? What is your consensus on like where this is now headed?
So I would be very interested to hear Avenger One's take on this. My take would be, I feel like in space, from what I've heard, it will probably not feel too different to what we have now. I kind of get the feel like this is an iteration. They were very careful on SCL to point out this was an updated flight model rather than a new flight model. So these are some updates that are coming rather than a complete rehashing. I think what is going to be new is more complexity in the atmospheric side. And in defense of Star Citizen's developers, atmospheric flight is much newer than space flight. We were doing space flight 10 plus years ago. The atmospheric side of things is much newer, albeit still a few years old. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it will do a lot more to introduce nuance to flight. Different scenarios are going to mean that your ship flies differently. And I think as somebody who flies planet side, who flies in space, that variety is going to be interesting. And especially as somebody who flies different ships, like getting used to the way that different ships fly will be interesting. I suspect it will feel quite different to what we've got now, but it's not going to be drastically complex. So, for example, when we talk about control surfaces, there are a lot of different things you could throw at that, right? You've got your ailerons that will roll the thing. You've got your elevators, which will do your pitch. You've got your rudder, which will do your yaw. Potentially, you've also got air brakes. You've got flaps. You've got slats. I don't think we're going to be seeing all of those more complicated control surfaces. I suspect it's going to be kind of 6 degrees, fairly straightforward, maybe if we're lucky with an air brake. So I'm hoping that means it's still accessible to people. But it'd be interesting to see, and it would definitely be interesting to fly the different ships and see how it impacts them differently. I like the idea that there are trade-offs to the choices that we make, that there are some things that are better at different tasks than others, and that the choices we make as players matter. So for me, I'm all for that. I'm excited to see it. I do like flying a Gladius around PlanetSide. I think this is going to make that even more fun. But ultimately, we need to know the detail. We need to know more about how it's going to work. And it's good that SCL dropped to start drip feeding. Kind of this is on the horizon. But like we said for engineering, how long away is the horizon? That remains to be seen.
Yeah. Okay, I got two more questions to end this off on. I'm sorry. The first is you mentioned that sort of like pear-shaped flight model, that they're allowing those main thrusters in the back to give you more power than your maneuvering thrusters, which are smaller, going sideways, up, down, backwards. Does this, to you, feel like it's taking away that Newtonian 6 degrees of freedom flight model of like you're just a thrusterful dot in space that can move in all directions? Does this ruin that simulated feeling to you?
No, I'm actually okay with that because of the way that most of the ships in Star Citizen are. They do tend to have main thrusters at the back and smaller thrusters everywhere else. Logically, that says to me, ship go forward better than it goes other direction. That doesn't mean it can't go other directions. So you don't have 6 degrees of freedom. You do, but your most powerful thrusters push you forward. That kind of makes sense to me. In atmosphere, that is probably going to feel even more so in some cases because you've also got those thrusters are pushing you forward and the lift of your ship is generating lift underneath the base of the ship. So again, for the way that aircraft actually fly, for me, that makes sense. You will still kind of have 6 degrees of freedom, I think, in atmospheric flight. But you've also got the constraint of wind shear or kind of air going around the ship that you'll have to deal with. I think the interesting cases that will prove or disprove my theory on this are going to be the ships that are not aircraft-like ships. So when I say aircraft-like, I mean they've got engines at the back that point forward and kind of it looks like airflow goes around them. There are some ships that are not like that. So I'm thinking like I don't know the Cartual or the Sulan or something like that, where perhaps the thrusters have the main thrusters at the back have more degrees of freedom. I think that could make those ships feel like they fly very, very differently, more so than they do now. But I like that. I like the idea that alien ships like a Cartual are going to feel weird and wibbly and different. That gives them personality. So for me, I'm okay with the pear-shaped because of how the ships are set up. If they had equally sized thrusters pointing in every direction of the ship, I would want much more 6 degrees of freedom. But most ships aren't designed like that.
Okay. And my final question for you, I am making an unofficial petition for Star Citizen and CIG to expand the size of planets, and I think that adding nuance to atmospheric flight, giving us more reason to be in different levels of flight, as you said, with the pressure, is a good excuse to expand the size of planets and their atmospheres. So can I mark you down as a yes on that petition?
I would back whatever decision the devs would make on that. I think the reason
That's a yes, folks. We're going to call that a yes.
the reasons we don't have full-size planets are, I think, number one, just the size of the terrain that you've got to paint below that and have enough interesting places.
Hey, I wasn't asking you for all the other things, Farrister. Okay, this is a yes or no, buddy. All right.
I'm gonna go with no.
Excuses.
Can I be controversial?
All right, get it. I'm gonna
Cross my signature
isn't even
off.
gonna air anymore. I gotta get a new guest. You guys, anybody in the chat want to come in? You guys want to take a spot? Ridiculous. All right. Well,
you could. You
heard it here first, folks. Farrister does not want you to have fun planets. Leave
That's
a comment in his videos.
I would rather have more planets than bigger existing planets. That would be the line I would take.
All right. Well, maybe at some point we'll see it, despite Farrister's going into CIG and holding the devs in threat to not increase the planet sizes. But until that does happen, we're going to call him a yes. Thank you, Farrister, for joining me today, man. I hope you enjoyed the chat. Was there anything else you wanted to finish with regarding the flight model, engineering, planet sizes?
Regarding the flight model, I would just say there are some really interesting examples out there, and I really liked that Yogi was drip feeding some of those examples of other games that do this into the SCL. I thought that was good. It shows that there's real thought going into this. I think on engineering, I am so excited for engineering gameplay for the larger ships. I'm definitely in the camp that think this is going to enhance the game. I'm excited for whenever it comes. I've been ready for it for a while now. And planet sizes are mostly fine as they are.
All right. And that's the official sign off from Farrister. Thanks again for joining me, my friend. Thank you, everybody, for watching or listening. If you're on YouTube, you get them ad-free episodes over on your audio platforms, whether it's Spotify, Apple, Google, Pocket Cast, whatever you like to use. Check us out over there. For all of you who do support, if you become a member on Space Tomato 2, we started that a little while ago as people were asking to support the podcast, and we really appreciate it. We are making sure that any video that we do publish in the meantime is available to you if it's going to be scheduled to go out later. And of course, anybody who supports, whether on Space Tomato 2 or anywhere else, you have early access to the podcast episodes, as well as live access to come join us in the chat and keep bickering against Farrister and heckling him in the meantime. So thanks again for joining the Launch Sequence podcast. I've been your host, Space Tomato. We've been talking about space things, and we'll probably be back to do it again next week. So I will see you guys then.